to our January no due date virtual salon. Pete's selection this month, as you know, was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and we're delighted to have our dear friend Russ Roberts join us to talk about this book. We will, of course, keep track of any links and so forth throughout the conversation and share them with you in the portal after. And of course, we'll make the video of this conversation available to our subscribers as well. It's nice to see so many of you in the virtual salon today. I've really enjoyed reading all of your comments in the portal on this incredible book so far, and I know you're all looking forward to talking with Russ. So I will stop talking and turn it over to Pete and Russ. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Amy. First of all, let me just introduce Russ. Russ Roberts is the president of Salon College in Jerusalem and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And as many of you know, he's the host of the weekly podcast, Econ Talk, which I believe has been running since 2007. Is that right, Russ?
2006.
2006. Got it wrong. And was your very first guest Milton Friedman?
No.
But he was on there pretty soon after.
He was on there in the first year.
Yeah. Okay. So before we get started with Russ, I wanted to just say to the group that many recent episodes of Econ Talk I have personally found essential to understanding the situation in the Middle East. And I'd like especially to recommend a conversation, and Russ, I'm probably going to get his name wrong, but Javi Gur, which I thought was just an amazing tour of the history and the complexities of the situation. So I recommend that to all of you. But Russ, today we're talking about Viktor Frankl and the ideas from that. And so thank you for joining us, and let's get started, huh?
Great. I just want to say it's great to see Pete, to see you and Amy and Shelley and Katie, all my Liberty Fund friends, and I miss you all. Wish I saw you more often, and glad everybody else is joining us. Great to be here.
So Russ, we, you might ask why, Viktor Frankl to kick off the year on a reading group, basically that focuses a lot on economics and public policy questions. And the reason that I picked this up was because while we've been doing economics and public policy, we've also taken a step back to think about economics more as what McCloskey calls today humanomics, in which these kind of questions about meaning and the human condition become a major part of our conversation. And to get started, I wanted to ask you to link this a little bit with your own journey that you've taken, because you were a Chicago-trained economist. One of the things Chicago-trained economists begin with in the Becker tradition is maximizing behavior as a fundamental behavioral characteristic. So we max utility subject to constraints, and that focuses on the implications of choice and consequences. And yet you've moved away from that, as reflected, say, for example, in your book, Wild Problems. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your own journey and whether or not the science of economics can be seriously done when we move away from focusing on maximizing against given constraints.
It's a great question. Can everybody hear me okay, by the way? Good. I was trained in a very narrow, McCloskey calls it max U. The idea that we're maximizing. Obviously, there's something to that, and certainly to the constraint part, subject to constraints. You can't avoid that. I think Gary Becker's approach to that methodological style was to open up what we maximize to lots of things that were traditionally the purview of economics: family, crime, so many other areas. And it's in his hands. It was a very powerful tool, and he got a lot of, quote, testable implications, which was his focus. And it helped him look for things to measure and observe. And if you read the treatise on the family or his book, decades earlier on the economics of crime, on the economics of discrimination, or his work on crime, his article, Crime and Punishment, in his hands, it's a very subtle tool. In most of our hands, it's not so subtle. It's a bit of a sledgehammer, and occasionally you need a sledgehammer. Doesn't mean you should ever use it. And I'm sure there are many, there's when you think of economics as a discipline and as a social science, it's a very powerful tool. And to be even more clear, it's the only social science with a tool that's remotely like that, which is why George Stigler said there's only one social science and we are its practitioners. So it's maximizing utility, the power of competition, emergent order, and other things like that are the backbone of economics. But it's not the backbone of all human behavior, what I understand as increasingly important. And of course, I concede that some of these things I'm going to say can be wedged into the maximizing utility framework, but I don't think that's so helpful, again, for most of us. And somewhere along the line, through Econ Talk mostly, I got interested in these other forms of aspects of the human experience, the feeling of belonging, the importance of transcendence, the essence of meaning. Reading a book like Tribe by Sebastian Junger, which is an amazing book. Most treatments of Tribe view it as a negative, that we're tribal. There's the other, and there's us, our team, the good team, and the other team, the bad team. And there's a part of human tribalism that's like that. But it's more than that. It's also the feeling of being part of something larger than yourself. And so those kind of issues seem to be increasingly important in America in 2015, say when Trump was running. All of a sudden, things that you and I had spent a lot of time trying to understand, inflation, fiscal policy, tax policy, incentives, they weren't front and center anymore. And I felt part of this is just purely maximizing. I felt if I was going to have something to say, I wanted to have something to say other than, say, fiscal policy, because it was clear that America was going through a identity crisis about what America meant, what it meant to be an American, where our country was headed. And it wasn't about tax policy anymore or inflation. Not that those things don't matter, they do, and there's still good things to understand. But our politics in America, and not just America, in Europe, to some extent elsewhere, is suddenly about who are we, and not so much about how much stuff can we consume or trying to achieve X, Y, Z. It's about what's it mean to be British? What's it mean to belong to something? What are the virtues and challenges or negatives of a religious life? So these are all things that I got increasingly interested in, and inevitably, the tools of economics, I think, are just mostly too blunt to be helpful in understanding those. So I've looked for other things to think about.
So I keep on, maybe it's a hopeless dream, but I keep on wanting to think about a way in which economics could be, sort of revised so it can actually deal like with a surgeon's scalpel knife rather than with a hammer on these very difficult questions. But before I'm going to tease that out a little bit, but before that, I just want to tell, I don't know if you remember this, Russ, but when Becker won the Nobel Prize in '92, when at the AEA meetings that year, when they celebrate the Nobel Prize, Viktor Frankl was the one who introduced him. And he was a comedian when he was younger. And so he was really quite funny when he got up there. One of the things he did was he said, Gary, he said, you worked on race and we ended up by having racial tensions in America. You worked on crime and we ended up by having an explosion of crime rates in America. Then you worked on the family and divorce exploded or whatever. He goes, I just want to know what the hell you're going to work on next so I can sell short. And so it was a great way to introduce Becker. But it is, I think that you're 100% right in the sense that in the hands of Gary Becker, the tools that he gives us, which are very blunt instruments, right? Maximizing stable preferences, competitive equilibrium, right? Those are the core ideas. In his hands, they become an engine of genius and creativity and whatnot. Whereas in some other versions, they end up by being dull and whatnot. So I think that's a very good question. But the question, I guess, that leads us to think about this broadening of economics is that whether or not that blunt instrument can take into account institutions, ideology, these other kinds of ways, or the way that they do it, does it enrich our understanding of the human condition or sterilize it? So, for example, the economics of religion. Is economics of religion, more figuring out what the cost benefit of different practices are, or is it the consequences of religious beliefs on the way I organize economic systems? And so the very first book that we read in this reading group was Jim Buchanan's Natural and Artifactual Man, well, the first volume of the collected works. And in that, he talks about this idea of aspirational man, us trying to become something that we're currently not, becoming better. You can't really squeeze that into the Max U framework. And yet Buchanan made his living on public choice being beyond romance, which is that, through that hardcore sort of application of economic reasoning, we identify and we lose the romance about politics. It might be fascinating that Buchanan took a similar journey to you. Because at the very end of his life, he wrote an essay called The Soul of Classical Liberalism, which is that I can't just, and he needed to do that. So I think maybe when we ask these big questions, we are forced to reconsider the tools that we're working with. And I wonder whether or not we can still do economics with that. So that's what leads to Viktor Frankl. So now let's talk a little bit about Viktor Frankl. He basically argues that a meaningful life, his sort of existentialism, is born from having a purpose greater than you, right? A great love that you feel, and then this more complicated idea about suffering, which might not be suffering in the same way we think about it in all times. I'm going to throw a kind of a curveball to you because you're an expert on Adam Smith as well. Hayek in Individualism and Economic Order has a great line where he says that despite all the criticisms of Adam Smith, I would line up Adam Smith against all the tomes of social psychology, and he would give us more insight into humanity than all these more modern tomes. And I was wondering if you could maybe negotiate that kind of conversation a little bit.
Well, there's I once gave a seminar on the theory of moral sentiments at Stanford. I won't identify the person who asked me this, but the person said, "Oh, come on. The book was written in 1759. I mean, haven't we learned anything since then about what makes us tick?" And I don't remember if I'd already read Ronald Coase on Smith, but Coase has a wonderful little, very short essay on, which I'm sure you know the name of, Pete, about the nature of man. And he says, there's a priceless paragraph in that article, which I learned about from Don Boudreau. The paragraph, I'm butchering it in terms of verbatim, but it's the sense is clear. He says, well, we've learned something. We've learned a lot from psychology, and some of it's true. And what he meant was a lot of it's not. Whereas Smith is maybe a little more reliable, that certain truths are internal about the nature of human beings. And Smith really had a lot of deep insights, and they haven't been overthrown by modern psychology. So, I think Smith understands a lot about human nature. He learned it not from doing a lot of randomized control trials. He sat in his armchair and talked to his friend David Hume, probably, and maybe chatted with his mother over dinner. But I think he understood a lot of things that obviously And, my favorite quote is, as you know, is man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. And that meaning that we want to be respected, admired, and praised, and we want to earn that honestly. That's a little outside of modern economics view of what makes us happy. You can squeeze it in again, but earning the respect of the people around us is obviously a huge part of what determines our well-being day to day. And I think the other quote from Smith is being the chief part of happiness is being loved, being beloved. And I think that's true. And that's part of Viktor Frankl. Can I move to the Frankl directly? Yep. So I read this book late in life. Many people read it when they're very young. I read it maybe 10 years ago. I'm thinking 5 or 10 years ago. I'm 69. So I read it close to the age of 60. And, I read it on my Kindle and under some duress. Meaning I felt weird I hadn't read it, and I read it. And I don't remember anything of it. Don't worry. I've reread it since then. But I was surprised at how little I remembered it. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a very good book. The main thing I remembered from it is related to what you just said. And I actually, having reread it in the last 2 hours, at least the first 100 or so pages, the pre-logotherapy part, although I read some of the logotherapy part too, because it's related, obviously. The standard summary of what Viktor Frankl has to say is that what matters in life isn't what happens to you, it's how you react to it. And I think that's a grotesque misreading of what this book's about, and mainly because if you think about it, it's like saying, if you have low expectations, you'll be happier than if you have high expectations, because you won't be disappointed. And I always want to say, so how do I have low expectations again? What's the trick? Where's that switch? You got the dial. Where's that dial? I need to. What's the setting? And so the idea that horrible things happen to you, just don't let it get you down. I think that's sort of the parody of what Frankl's saying in this book, and I think that's obviously not what he's saying. The second version of it is similar. I've read this. I think it's actually in the introduction of the version I read by the foreword by Harold Kushner. Yeah, there's 3 ways to find meaning in life: work, love, and suffering. That's not what he says either. And again, that's just I think a misreading of what Frankl's saying. So what I take him to be saying on this question of suffering and how you deal with it, which is the parody Twitter version, I think the way I understood what he's saying is quite subtle and quite nuanced, and it's worth reading the book at least twice to get a better understanding. And it's very much like, I think, what Buchanan has to say in Natural and Artifactual Man. What I take Frankl to be saying is that in a life of suffering, and all life has some, if not a lot of suffering in it, it's inevitable, the human condition. We're supposed to make something of that. It's not our attitude toward it that redeems our suffering. It's how we use our suffering to transform our inner life. And that's why what I call the parody version has some, it's kind of related, but it's a much deeper and subtler and more nuanced idea, which is that it's not just what's your attitude toward it or how you get through it by having low expectations or thinking, well, I'm not as unlucky as the other person. They have even worse suffering, so I'm okay. That's obviously not what he's saying. What he's saying is that you can use your suffering to perform art, to create an inner life for yourself that transcends your utility, what we would call your Benthamite, most of what Bentham is talking about, the pleasures and pains of daily life. And what I take Frankl to be saying is that if you think of yourself as a utility machine, as a collector of utils, net, positive relative to negative, he's saying that's really not what life's about. What life is about is how you experience those things. It is not about an attitude of coping with it. It's using it as a form of raw material to enrich your inner life, both what you then achieve, how you cope with it, surely, but more than how you cope with it, how you use it to make your life meaningful, how you use it to overcome, how you use it to be better. And he says explicitly, instead of asking, I mean, it's the most anti-economics line that we can think of. I wrote a book, one of my books. I said, the definition of economics is how to get the most out of life, which is a student had told me that line from another faculty member. Didn't remember who said it, a teacher of hers. That is a interesting definition of economics, but I think it's a really bad way to think about how to live. And obviously, my book, Wild Problems, is a attempt to answer why that's not a good way to live. And what Frankl says is it's not like what can I expect of life, but what does life expect of me? What is my role? What am I called to do? What is my purpose? What can I do better than others? How can I love? How can I share? How can I give? That's, I think, what Frankl means by how we answer suffering. But it also, and he doesn't write this because he's come out of Auschwitz, but it's also about how we deal with success. It's not just about suffering. It's how we deal with pleasure. How do we, when things go our way, what lessons do we learn from it? And I think a lot of what Frankl is saying is we need to transcend our daily experiences, whether they are painful or pleasurable. The painful ones we need to transcend because we have to ask, what am I to make of this? How do I learn from it? What can I do to cope with this? And for the success, it's the same question. When things go well for us, whether it's in you can see it in one of the reasons that you and I like sports so much, I think, Pete, is that I got this line once from Mike Munger. He says, sports doesn't build character, it reveals it, right? And that's about success and failure. And what kind of person are you in response to success or failure? Most athletes are young, right? Their careers are short. Certainly those of us who played sports in our youth did it for a very short period of time. And the character building or character revealing aspect of it is long over, but that's true of the whole rest of life. What we endure, what we are lucky enough to have that's positive, it reveals our character. And of course, it's a simultaneous system. It's part of how we respond to those ups and downs is a measure of what kind of human being we are. So that's what I take Frankl to be saying. And I think that's what, if you listen to that, I quoted myself at least twice. So obviously it's how I read that text, maybe is very idiosyncratic based on my own interests and my own way of seeing life. But I think it's a fair reading. I went back, I looked very carefully when I was reading every time he invoked suffering. And every time he did, it to me was a slightly different answer. It wasn't straightforward and clear. It's not laid out cleanly. It's a meditation on what it means to endure unspeakable barbarity. And in many ways, Solzhenitsyn is a parallel to Frankl in how he feels we should respond, again, to suffering and the moral dilemmas. Frankl is extremely forgiving of the camp's brutality and that impact of that brutality on people's moral decision-making. He doesn't judge anybody, and yet at the same time, he tells you a few heroes that rose above that. And again, to come back to economics, then I'll stop talking. In economics, we believe people respond to incentives. Well, the incentives of the camp are pretty clear. And yet Frankl's very insistent on letting us know that some people rose above those incentives and did things that weren't in their narrow self-interest. In fact, there's a shocking line in the book where I think he says somebody's caught stealing. Yeah, that's what it was. Somebody's caught stealing a small amount of potatoes, and they tell the people in the camp, you're all going to have to fast until you give up. You're going to go with that food until you give up the person who stole the potatoes. Tell us who it was. And he says, of course, there's no question that we're all going to fast. Well, that's totally inconsistent with so many things he wrote about before, about how people under horrific duress did things that they would normally be ashamed of. But can you blame them? And yet somehow he finds it totally natural that 2,500 men suffered horribly to do what they decided was the right thing. But extremely interesting, obviously.
Yeah. There's a couple things in there that are kind of interesting and related, I think, to even the world today. In terms of, so he has a line in there, this is in the logo theory stuff. He has a line in there comparing his students in Europe and his students in the US. And he says that the students in Europe, 25% of them, have no purpose or anything like that, but 60-something% in the US has, no purpose or feeling about this. And when I was reading it again, I'm very influenced by your Econ Talk discussions and the things that you do on there. And I remember this great episode you did on dignity, right? That this guy who wrote a book on dignity, traveled around the Midwest.
Yeah, Chris Arnaudy.
And it's so connected to the kind of concerns that Deaton and Case have in the deaths of despair, and what's happened. And, we're puzzled and trying to figure these things out. And it is a question of how it is that we develop our character in the face of all this stuff. Two stories in the book that I think relate and reinforce what you were talking about, or at least I read them that way. I'm the same as you. I don't know what's Frankl. I don't know what's me telling you.
Yeah.
But I think the story about his treatment of a doctor whose wife had died and was in depression is a very telling story, because what he does is he flips the story. He says to the doctor, he says, well, what if it had been you who died and your wife was the one who survived? How would she deal with it? And then he says, oh, she would deal with it horribly. And then, Frankl flips it and says, well, then realize that you saved your wife from that suffering, right? You're doing that. And then the guy shook his hand and walked out of the room and, moved on with a better understanding. And the other one is his own self-description of himself. So he's a neurologist, a psychiatrist, but then he says also a survivor. And it was in being a survivor that he then developed what you said, what we make of this raw material, and you go forward with it. And that's a very big driver of his. The other thing that I think that you and I, as authors, that feel like we have things on our chest that we have to get off, is that the fact that he had his manuscript, ripped from him, and then he had to reconstruct it, and he did it on little scraps of paper and stuff while he could. It's an amazing story, actually, to do that. And you think about that as a writer and how much energy you put into those projects, even when no one else really cares about what you're working on, but it's like such a big part of you.
It doesn't matter. It's a form, obviously that's the example of how work can redeem your, anything that you're enduring. It's interesting because Solzhenitsyn obviously wrote thousands of pages on little scraps of paper and got them out of the gulag. There is a rabbi in the Warsaw Ghetto called the Piasetzner Rebbe who gave weekly sermons to his congregation, his community inside the ghetto, and wrote them down and in tiny print and stuffed them inside a milk can and buried them in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they were discovered. And so that you could read those. They're called Holy Fire. But our desire to as human beings to speak, to be heard, to be seen, it's just to have dignity. These are all parts of this sort of primal human drives that are not material and not as they don't fall normally under the rubric of economics.
Yeah.
What was the first thing you talked about, Pete, before the story about the doctor and the wife? You said something else. What was your opening comment? Do you remember?
No.
I wanted to say something.
Sorry.
I wanted to say something about it, but
Yeah.
oh well. Oh, I know what it was. It was
I
about the
wanna-
deaths
I-
of despair. It was about the deaths of
Yes,
despair.
the
What was I
despair
saying?
stuff. Yeah.
So I just want to say, I think it's very. I'm living in Israel now. It's a very hard time. We have 136 hostages still in Gaza. We hope. We don't know how many are alive. Every once in a while, they kill one and announce it. It's so grotesquely painful here, and people are dying in the war every day. We've lost a student. We've lost relatives of our students. It's very challenging, and at the same time, it's the most meaningful period of my life to be associated with the people who are doing these things that are trying to keep the country together. The volunteering, the civil society aspect of Israel right now is just it's extraordinary. Obviously, nothing in my life in America was remotely like this, other than maybe the week or two after 9/11, and it was very, very different. Here, there's been such a government failure in terms of responding to the crisis of October 7th, and so the private sector, the voluntary sector, just fills the gap, and it's very common here. It's a very standard form of response that Israelis just get things done, and it's gloriously meaningful. There's not a lot of people who are wondering what their purpose is. They may be in despair, but they all have a tremendous sense of purpose, and it's exhilarating. You feel a little guilty feeling exhilarated about it from time to time because of the pain that others nearby. I mean, I have a colleague 2 doors down who's got 3 sons in Gaza, so you can't talk to them when they're in Gaza. So imagine what that's like. Or my colleague 5 doors down who's got a husband and a son in the war, and you're not allowed to talk to them. They're not allowed to have a cell phone. You might hear from them for an hour. There might be an hour window where they come out and they can use their cell phone. There are people I know who haven't talked to their husband or their son for 90 days. And each day you open the paper and you have to say, I hope he's alive. Yeah. So that world, and everybody knows this, it's a horrible paradox of the human condition. I don't know if you saw the movie, I think it's called They Shall Not Grow Old. It's a movie about World War I, and it's a brilliant film. They took footage of World War I, and they have, it's all silent, but they lip sync the movement of the lips of the people in the war, and they put in a soundtrack. And then they interview people with the soundtrack who went through it, and it's horrible. It's rats in the trenches, it's infections on your feet because you never get dry. It's raining, day in, day out. You're standing in icy water. It's one of the worst things you could possibly imagine. And they asked these veterans, the ones who lived, of course, it's a selected group, what was it like? Oh, it was hell. They're all British. It was hell, but I wouldn't have missed it for the world. And there's this weird thing about war. War is hell, but the people who live through it struggle afterward to find purpose, because what they had before, nothing will ever be as purposeful as saving the lives of your comrades or defending your country. And so, one of the things I worry about, we're about to start classes in a week here for the students who are no longer in the Army. We had 60% of our students in the Army, and they're being released. The war in Gaza is being slowly, the temperature is lower and fewer people are needed. I don't know what they're going to be like, but one thing they're going to struggle with is what am I doing here reading Plato after I was trying to, this is a story of this woman. I wish she was my student. I don't think she is, but there's a tank in front of her. The tank gets hit by a shell. one person's dead, other person's lost his leg. She pulls the guy who's lost his leg out of the tank, pulls behind a wall, tightens a tourniquet, saves his life. And meanwhile, she's returning fire against people who are trying to kill her and this wounded soldier. I mean, I like to think I'm a good teacher, but there's no classroom moment like that. That's a life overwhelming experience and a lot of people can't cope with that transition. So plus we have people who've dealt with horrible trauma, much worse than that. So it's going to be an incredible experience. But my point is that the level of purposefulness here is unbelievable. And let me give you one more example of this. You can imagine what the front page of the newspaper is like here every day. It's about so-and-so got killed. It's about we're under pressure to do this kind of ceasefire. It's about whether they're making any progress. It's about Blinken is visiting. My daughter is doing an art residency in England in a small town, and she read me the front page of the paper there, and it was the bells in the church are going to need a new clapper and a new pin. And, when that's your biggest problem, it's kind of nice, but it's quieter. And here, everything matters every single day. That was before the war. So now it's even more intense. So we have people in despair, but it's not the kind of despair of what's my life? I mean, what am I going to do? We don't have a lot of drug problems right now. We're going to have some PTSD. This could be horrific. But in the middle of this, people rise to the occasion. And that's really what Viktor Frankl is talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So that is fantastic, Russ. So I want to turn it over to the group to ask questions to you. So Daniel, go ahead. You have your hand up.
Right. Russ, I'd like to just build off of what you were just talking about now, with the sense of in Israel, there seems to be this extreme clarity on purpose, and tie it back into what Frankl has said about how there is this intensification of inner life that he felt while in the camps, and how by going through these deprivations, this experience, in a way, he paid attention to life in a way that he had not done before. And I know you've talked about meditation retreats that you've done, or at least one, and I don't want to compare a meditation retreat to a concentration camp, but there is an experience there of, by being so limited and sort of restricted, in that you actually find a clarity that you did not have before. So I'd like you to speak to that if you could.
Yeah, it's again, I think one of the paradoxes of the human condition is, I think, often about the line of William Blake, to see the world in a grain of sand. I'm not sure what that means, but it speaks to me along the lines you're talking about. It's that even the smallest thing has beauty and majesty and awe embedded in it. And it's just so hard to pay attention. It's so hard. And life can force you to pay attention. When you have, quote, time on your hands and you spend it mindlessly leafing through YouTube or X or wherever your social media habits take you. Pete, you'll like this one. When I used to live in America, I didn't have cable, but I'd watch 9 hours of NFL football on many Sundays before I got married. Not so many after I got married, but in my youth, you'd watch the 1 o'clock game, then you get the 4 o'clock game, and then you had the evening game. Yeah. And then and I enjoyed every minute of it. And then when it was over, it was like, what did I do today? How did I become and so that luxury, and only a wealthy society can afford to have millions of people watching NFL football. Again, here we don't have that luxury. But I will tell a story. one of my students spent 7 weeks in Gaza. He got out twice. He said once to Tel Aviv to a coffee shop and once to a wine bar. And he said it was very disorienting, looking around at all these people enjoying themselves. It just seemed weird. And then he said, but that's why we're fighting, so that we can sit around in a wine bar and be in the company of someone we care about, laugh. And so there's this tension in life between the mundane as meaningless. Oh, you sat around all day and watch football, or you sat around all day and drank coffee with your friend. And yet I won't try to defend football, but coffee with your friend can be a hugely enriching life experience, because they need you to share something. They want to share something with you, or just the connection you make with another human being. But if you're not careful, all you're doing is scrolling through your phone mindlessly, killing time. And killing time is something to be avoided. So when you're in the concentration camp, God forbid, or you're in some situation of stress, it's like Samuel Johnson said, the knowledge of man is going to be hung in a fortnight concentrates the mind wonderfully. Life has an intensity, and obviously that's a bad set of restraints, a concentration camp or a gulag, because a lot of times the pain is so great you can't enjoy the small things. But ideally, in our lives, we're blessed not to have anything remotely like that. We should be able to occasionally appreciate the moment. And just to say one other thing about Frankl, a lot of what he's saying is really different from the Buddhist meditation-oriented stuff I've learned, and sometimes like and sometimes don't like, which is the Buddhist perspective, which is also a Jewish tradition to some extent, is live in the moment. Not live in the moment like have fun, but don't miss the thing that's right in front of you that's quite beautiful, because you're so obsessed with the past or so looking ahead to the future. And it's interesting to me how much Frankl talks about the power of the past and the power of the future to sustain you through difficult times that he's writing about. And obviously, my mom's 92, and she'll say to me, I'll talk to her and she'll say, well, we're getting ready for your visit. Are you ready? And I'm going to see her, I think, in about 3 weeks. And this would be a month ago. So I'd be seeing her in almost 2 months. We're getting ready for your visit. Are you? And I'd say, Mom, I'm not going to think about that till I'm on the plane much, or when I'm packed. And I'm not going to pack now. But when you're 92, looking ahead to things is very, very important for my mom. And I think a lot of older people, and I get that, and a lot of younger people. But it's always, I look ahead to it, and then when it comes, I got to find another thing to look ahead to. And I don't think that's a very healthy way to live. It's interesting that Frankl talks so much about it. So I don't agree with the extreme view that says only live in the moment. I think you have to look to the future, and you have to savor the past and learn from the past. But it's interesting to me how much he emphasizes tougher situation, I guess. So,
Robert?
Yes. Hi. Thanks.
Oh, no, not Robert Hansen.
Oh.
Then Robert Weir.
Sorry, I blame my mother. Russ already kind of half answered this, and I'll try to reformulate the question a little bit. Is that, reading Frankl, one of the things it's hard for me to kind of not take away from his experience, the way that he's laid things out, is that the inference to draw is that there's almost a paradox in human happiness or human existence, in that we almost need suffering to find meaning, that there has to be something that you have to overcome, or something that you need to be working on or working towards, to not fall into some type of nihilism. And yet we always want to try to avoid those things that cause suffering. That we don't want to be in that situation that Frankl found himself in. Is it really true that kind of like happiness in a sense, is that existence in a sense, is paradoxical in that sense, or is it something that's non-terrible in a sense that will help give us meaning to our lives that isn't pure suffering?
Well, again, I think it's an interesting contrast to the economist's view. The economist's view says all suffering's bad. You want to just always be happy. And one, that's not possible. And two, it leads to the paradox of, why are you banging your head against the wall? Because it feels so good when I stop. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's a very good way to think about things. But I want to say something else. State your question again.
Sorry. Is it really true that that life is kind of paradoxical in the sense? Is there something like beyond like the pleasure principle? Because like you were mentioning, like you watch 9 hours of football, feels really good in the moment, but then you go, oh geez, what that day is just gone. And maybe when I was 20 and I was in school and having to read all these things, and I just wanted a day to do nothing. Now if I do nothing, I'm like, oh geez, the roof is gonna leak in it still. The kids need sandwiches. God, that lawn's getting long.
I think it's a couple things, but for that, I think it's more like I just took 9 hours off my life. I didn't get anything for it. A little bit of pleasure is not that exciting. But I was going to actually reference something else he said, which I found I think is quite profound. But again, partly because I agree with it already, which is happiness is not something you pursue, and that's another paradox, right? He's very clearly says you shouldn't be trying to be happy. It's a byproduct more than an endpoint that you should strive for. And just to add in another Buddhist idea, I think Buddhism is very not focused, but it's one of the ideas of Buddhism is that pain comes from trying to avoid suffering, not necessarily from the suffering itself. I think I might be confusing my Econ Talk book today. I read 2 books today, but it's like it's either in Frankl or the book I read for my Econ Talk interview today, which is we dread going to the dentist. Was that in this book? Okay, yeah. It was.
Yeah.
Some say yes, some say no, but anyway, it's an interesting thing. I mean, how much time do we spend dreading things like that and that hang over us? And it's the dreading of it that causes the pain. It's not the thing itself often. And in fact, I've said this a few times on Econ Talk. It's amazing how many painful experiences we have that fade very quickly with time. The fact that women have more than one child is really an extraordinary thing that is useful to think about when we think about the human condition. Yes, it's a very painful thing. But once it's over, we don't look back on it and suffer from past physical pain. At least I think most people don't. I think about my horrible trips to the dentist. I've had a bunch. In the moment, they were awful, and I dreaded going the next time. And I look back, it's like, well, it's over. And it's not like the good things I remember, which I can savor and enjoy. They don't still cause me pain. And yet, why can't I look ahead and say, when I go to the dentist, it's going to be painful, but it'll be over, and then I'll move on. And I think if you can adopt that attitude, it's a little bit like I was saying at the beginning of this conversation. Good luck, but it is possible to work at that and get better at it, I think. And it is a very, I think, useful way to deal with suffering. Is to not. There's no reason to pay for it twice. The anticipation and the actual suffering.
Rob Weir.
Hi, thanks. I found Frankl's concept of the existential vacuum kind of a very useful one, and I think he admirably shows how it can be addressed through introspection, study, and through kind of one-on-one tutoring and discussion. I'm just wondering kind of at scale, you mentioned that he mentioned 60% of Americans saying they suffered, in his opinion, from existential vacuum. Historically, though, we found, starting like maybe William James's Moral Equivalence of War on through fascist movements in the mid 20th century, mass movements that attempt to give people meaning in life, attempt to make sense of their suffering, et cetera, et cetera. So that existential vacuum seems to be much more efficiently addressed by things that we probably don't want. So I was wondering if Russ or anyone else had an idea of how could you take logotherapy or something equivalent to scale to fill that existential vacuum that doesn't require kind of that one-on-one experience of logotherapy?
So that's a great question. I'll just say something about it here in Israel, and then anyone else wants to weigh in. We're having a bit of a religious revival here. We are a Jewish country, but many people here don't practice the Jewish religion in any active way. They're just Jewish by cultural heritage, their family, and they're feel connected to the country because most of us are Jews, but they don't follow Jewish religion in any organized way. Well, in response to October 7th, a lot of people are much more interested in Judaism and religious practice than they were before, which is, I mean, we could hypothesize about why that's true. On the surface, it seems, again, paradoxical. You'd think you'd want to run away from God after October 7th rather than embrace God, but that is not the human response. A lot of those movements that you're talking about in the 20th century, fascism and communism, were an attempt to substitute those ideological concepts for religion, which used to give people meaning, used to give people a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. So there can, and by the way, even though I'm religious, I understand that some of the historical applications of religiosity also weren't so healthy. So it's complicated, but I do think religion has evolved into something that I think is much more healthy at scale than it was in the past, and I mean that about most major religions, and it's certainly more healthy than not all of them, but some of them, and it's certainly healthier than some of the mass movements you're talking about. But I used to like to think everything's getting better all the time. But one other way to interpret what you're saying is that most of the ways we fill the holes in our heart are not necessarily very healthy. And I think that's true. And I don't think that's going to get better anytime soon.
Just so to be mindful of everything, I have to cut off in 7 minutes, but I'm going to ask Amy to take over because I think these remaining questions are really need to be voiced to you, Russ. But since I might cut out early, I just want to really thank you for coming on and sharing your insights here with us. So, Jason?
Yes, thank you. In the logotherapy section, every age has its own collective neurosis. I was curious, how would you revise or update Frankl on the collective neurosis of our age? And then secondly, as a institutionalist, what does responsibleness look like in response to that?
That's a tough question. I have to leave at 7 also, by the way, so I apologize if I'm not going to get to all the questions, but feel free to continue talking without me. I don't know what the answer to that question is, or what our collective neurosis is. There seems to be a bunch of them. Social media seems to be a unhealthy technological innovation that is damaging to democracy and for many of us. Again, I hope that there's some kind of pendulum swinging back to a less digital age. I think that's probably a fantasy, probably not going to happen. But we do have a temptation to live inside the digital world increasingly, and that doesn't seem so healthy to me. I have the Jewish Sabbath for 25 hours. I don't interact with social media, but I more than make up for it in those other 6 days. I have a feeling, so I'm not going to tell you that somehow I'm in perfect mental health. So,
Ryan?
Half pushback and half agreement with Frankl's idea that happiness cannot be pursued. And you know, says one must have a reason to be happy. Once the reason is found, one becomes happy automatically. I view it as more of a process, almost in a Hayekian or Kurtzanerian way, where it's not an on-off switch that you can turn on or off. It's not something that can be pursued or caught, but it's an ongoing process of reflection and improvement, hopefully. But what do you think, Frankl, and what do you think of that idea?
well, I do think it's an ongoing. I would just add one little piece to that last part, which is I've come to feel that a lot of what is important for making progress on these issues is self-awareness. It's taken me a long time to figure out what my strengths and weaknesses are, and my own neuroses, my own, not collective, but personal challenges. I've never done psychotherapy, but those meditation retreats I was on did have a strong psychotherapeutic element, and they were very powerful. Because of the instruction we received, I was forced to confront things about my own patterns of behavior I was not aware of. And I think that's an extraordinarily wonderful thing. I think you can get that from prayer, you can get it from meditation, you can get it from therapy, you can get it from fiction, you can get it reading fiction. There are a lot of different ways to explore your own self. And if you're not careful, it's a navel-gazing experience. I'm not in favor of that. But I do think there are ways to step outside yourself and be more aware of your own shortcomings and patterns of behavior that you do automatically without thinking. So I think that's all that getting to know yourself is really important.
Is it thin? We just have a few more minutes, so yeah.
Yes.
Welcome to No Due Date, Finn.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. Well, I just want to comment real quick on what was it, Jason? He said, found a little parallel to Hayek also, in that, okay, sorry. Like, so similar to our society, he said that it's more sufficient when everybody pursue their own goals, and that, like, you don't define what is it exactly you're pursuing. So I have a parallel here to the thing with success, that you don't pursue it.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think a lot of the best things in life are undesigned, and I also think a lot of them are unplanned for our own selves. I think planning is not unimportant, but it's overrated, both for our personal self and it's certainly at the national level. Yeah, so that's a nice analogy.
There's a passage in Frankl where he's talking about the dilemma. This relates, I think, to stuff that Rob Weir raised as well. But he says no instinct tells him what he has to do, and this is modern man, and no tradition tells him what he ought to do. And so, what happens a lot of times, we end up by being conformist or totalitarian, or we could live a free and responsible life, right? And so he has this other line where he says that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast should be met with a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. And, when you read it, it's kind of jarring, but he's asking this question. And to me, I was thinking, okay, so this is exactly what you were talking about, because when we don't have instincts that completely drive us the way that we would in our animalistic life, or we don't have tradition to be the only thing that guides us as we did, but we're stuck in our world of modernity, we're forced to make something of our lives with our choices. And that's one of the main contemplative things I think that the book forces you to do, is to think about that. And just to end up, Russ, if you could give us 2 or 3 additional books on the Holocaust that you think would be very valuable to understand.
Great. I just want to recommend a few. These are just my personal idiosyncratic favorites. Econ Talk listeners will know I'm a big fan of Primo Levi. Primo Levi survived Auschwitz, and most people think he committed suicide much later in his life. I don't think he did. There's a wonderful article explaining why that. He fell down a stairwell. I don't think he threw himself off the stairs. I think he fell. He was old and he was on drugs and medication. But it's interesting how much I care about that. It's not rational. I don't like the idea that the Nazis killed him out of despair decades later. But anyway, he wrote 2 books. All of his books are interesting, but he wrote 2 books about the camps. One in the English American titles are Survival in Auschwitz, and I think it's called The Awakening. And those are not the titles in the original. The original Italian titles translated literally are If This Is Man and The Truce. And The Truce is a really great title, because The Truce is about his return from Auschwitz, how he got home. It's not a particularly happy book. It's a fascinating book for an economist to read. It's all about bargaining and negotiation. He has very few resources, he and the other people trying to get back, and they get taken in terrible directions. They end up going the wrong way because they're not in charge of where they're going. And it's a remarkable book. It's not well known, so I recommend that. And If This Is Man is title in English, the American version is Survival in Auschwitz. But you can get the 2 books together on Amazon in one, If This Is Man and The Truce. I recommend those. They're phenomenal. He's very thoughtful, very interesting book. I really want to recommend an essay by Vasily Grossman called The Hell of Treblinka. It's in a book called The Road. The Road's a collection of Grossman's shorter writings. It's really quite, it's hard to read, but it's an important book. And I'm reading a book now called The Power of Forgiveness. It's written by a woman, Eva Kor, K-O-R, who on the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz forgave the Nazis, forgave Mengele. She was a twin. She was operated on with her twin sister, played with as an experimental object by Mengele in Auschwitz. And she forgives the Nazis. And that made a lot of people mad. And I wrote about it recently in an essay, Amy, on my Substack. You can call Listening to the Sirens. You can post that for people if they're interested. What does that mean? How do you forgive the Nazis? And is that really is that a moral act? And her book is quite fascinating. It's both because of that, which is an important thing to understand, I think, and to think about, this idea of forgiving people who did horrific things to you, and also just her personal journey is interesting. So I would recommend that. With it's not a 5-star book, but it's quite interesting if you're interested in this question of forgiveness. But I'd emphasize the Primo Levi, and I'd emphasize the Road by Grossman, in the essay in there, The Hell of Treblinka.
Well, Russ, thank you very much. As always, it's even in these difficult times, it's a great pleasure to be able to reach out and connect with you.
Wonderful.
Benefits of the digital world is that we have this. But thank you very much. And thanks to everyone here. And we'll see you again next month.
Yes.
Take care, everybody. It's great.
Alrighty.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we have our happy hour on Friday. I'd love to see you then. It'll be 8 p.m. Eastern time on the link in the New Date channel. Hope to see you then. Thanks.
Yes, and see you all in the portal. You'll find Katie's happy hour announcements there, as well as Pete will have another Ask Me Anything in March sometime. I know Shelly has it set up, so we'll see you there. Thanks, Pete. Thanks to all of you. It's great to see you. Happy New Year.